क्या बोल रही deep fried की public? I preemptively apologize for that. Not that any of you give a shit, but welcome to episode 105 of the Deep Fried Neurons podcast. And today we're discussing the philosophical concepts discussed by Ludwig Van Wittgenstein in both Tractatus, Logico, Philosophicus, and Philosophical Investigations. So both of those are recommended readings for this episode or after the episode. As for the bits about perception where we've cited psychological material, I suggest Harlow's Developmental Psychology, a lifespan approach, which you should get on Amazon if you're at all curious. But that's the one I referred. If you can go get it at a library, it would be much cheaper. That's what I recommend. For the last bit, I recommend Ratan Lal and Dheeraj Lal, but nothing too fancy. Like I know it's a legal textbook and it'll be a little inaccessible for most of you, but you can also Google culpable homicide and murder. But that's the source that I have taken, Ratan Lal and Dheeraj Lal. And finally, the Aadhaar judgment itself. If you want, you can check out the Legally Tried Neurons episode on the privacy case that is also mentioned in this episode. And that's it. I'm gonna cue the fucking... Ever since we did the episode on solipsism on this podcast, one of the things that I've repeated over and over again every time there has been a discussion about research or reaching the truth in a very dry literary sense or the most exciting CIA story type sense is that we perceive reality beyond the wall of perception. For the fact that, you have five senses and those five senses kind of operate in a way that gathers data from your surrounding of a certain thing. For example, temperature you feel on your skin. Visuals are created by the interactions of visible light with your eyeballs, and wavelength that can be heard is heard by you through your ears. And you're chemically capable of smelling and tasting things depending on how they react with your muscles and secretions and whatnot. And these senses are quite aggressively limited. One of the examples of which I found in Vsauce's video, as I do in a lot of cases. So Vsauce, for example, makes this excellent point that if you turn your tongue upside down and touch it from left to right, it won't feel like you're touching your tongue from right to left. It will still feel like it's touching from left to right, because you never needed to evolve to understand what is left to right tongue touch. If you're doing this in public, you do look ridiculous. I should remind you that. If you're doing it in private, you look curious. You go champ. Champ is gender neutral, right? I'm going to use champ. We also have spent quite a lot of time on this podcast talking about the 3 C's of truth finding, which is commonality, consistency, and consensus. The way those 3 concepts apply to this episode are in the way that they're practiced in the methods of truth finding. In the sense, somebody, when they make observations, the 3 things that they seek out of these observations is that in what other experiments that I know of or in experiences that I know of have things operated because of the same powers or similar observations. How many times do I repeat the same experiment and find the same results, consistency, and how many other people agree with me that what I am seeing is what they are seeing. Today's episode, we talk mostly about the last bit because that is the one that we have trouble with the most. And the troubles in seeking consensus have been identified the best by a gentleman named Ludwig Van Wittgenstein. Again, Ludwig Van Wittgenstein has come up on this podcast multiple times because his book is something I've read over 2 to 3 times over a period of 3 years because I had trouble paying attention. Also because he's quite an organized writer, which I find annoyingly difficult to pay attention to. But the last time we discussed him, it was in the aesthetic episode with Himanshi and Aditi, where we were talking largely about how Wittgenstein's claim about how we communicate through visual images talks about aesthetic. and how it defines aesthetic, and how when aesthetic comes before practice of space or utility, how do those two things interact with each other when it comes to the very basic question of human invention. And we never really explored Wittgenstein's literature itself. So I thought, since I have all the time in the world after I've graduated, I will sincerely try and pay attention to Wittgenstein's philosophy, which is why I read Tractatus, Logico Philosophicus, which is his first book, and the second book, Philosophical Investigations. However, I will tell you, if you're going to cut off this episode right now and go and read those books, that you should read Philosophical Investigations, because it's a correction of the first book, and the first book was a giant waste of time after reading the second book. But if you're inclined towards philosophical literature, by all means, I recommend both of them as a read. They're very organized, which is a refreshing turn of events for most philosophy students. As for Wittgenstein, before we discuss his observations and philosophy and observations in philosophy, I think it's important that we should look into his life itself. He was born in 1889 in Vienna, and he was born to a very wealthy steel industrial family. 3 of his 4 brothers killed themselves, and Wittgenstein himself struggled with suicidal thoughts, or that is the claim on multiple places in multiple accounts of his life. He was quite a recluse and had trouble interacting with other people, which is where he thought it was an important thing that he talks about communication and psychology as one of his biggest contributions to philosophy. He studied engineering himself at the time, and after his father died, he gave away most of his money to his relatives and went and lived in one of the longest fjords in Norway. And the reason he had the ability to sustain all of that is because he inherited the 3rd biggest estate in Austria at the time, and gave away most of that money to his relatives, and then took some for himself and lived a life of a recluse student of philosophy. The 2 most important works of philosophy that he produced are the ones that I've read for this episode: Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Philosophical Investigations. After he wrote the first book, he thought there was nothing else to write about or do in philosophy, and hence he left philosophy and took up architecture. And after a long break, he returned to philosophy and wrote Philosophical Investigations, which was published after his death. Before we head into Ludwig van Wittgenstein's literature himself, we have to understand the philosophical problem it deals with. It deals with perception and language, and which is why Wittgenstein believed, and still to a certain point arguably does, answer the greatest question in philosophy. Because if philosophy is the study of fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, then the methodology of collecting the experience of reality and existence and comparing with somebody else's experience of reality and existence become the central methodologies for all philosophy. Essentially, it is important to understand how we perceive reality and how we communicate it to somebody else in order for the branch of philosophy itself to be credible, and for that methodology itself to have a high amount of credibility and a very low amount of error. Now, Wittgenstein's work mostly deals with language. In the sense, most of the book, at least with Philosophical Investigations, he talks about how language fundamentally fails to describe the incomprehensible nature of reality. However, part 2 of this book talks about psychology, which essentially talks about the methodology of perception. And luckily, we've made strides in that area. So, in this episode, before we start with the criticisms of language and the limitations of perception that Wittgenstein himself put in place, let's understand what we know about the knowledge of perception and how it shapes our ability to communicate what we perceive, which is language. Now, I know for most of us, all of our thought happens in language. which is what Wittgenstein maintains in both of his books. But also, we know that language is not what we know from whence we're birthed. So let's start at the extreme beginning and evaluate from the moment you're born, how does life work? To the best of my knowledge, I have not come across somebody narrating a credible experience of them being a child, because you don't have a lot of cognitive abilities at the time, as is well known through psychological studies. But what we do know is that that's where the fundamental belief of psychology is established in terms of study. Psychology, when it started, was a very simple study, that there is a behavior, and this behavior seems to be stemming from a stimulus that the person exhibiting the behavior has received. So, if you can establish a relationship between a stimulus and its responsive behavior, you have the study of psychology. In the sense that there is a response and there is a stimulus, and you find the relationship between the stimulus and the response, and that becomes your rudimentary behaviorist approach to the study of psychology. And this is very exhibitable in newborn babies and children between the ages of 0 to 5. For example, the moment a child is born, if you pinch the child, it has a stimulus of pinch, which exhibits as pain, and pain has a response, which is crying. The child looks at colors and laughs, which means the color is the stimulus and laughter is the response. But this is not an absolute watertight explanation of human behavior. For example, a lot of behavior that humans exhibit is also exhibited in the absence of any stimulus. Does that mean that this behavior is unexplainable? Of course not. It means that there is a stage between stimulus and response where there is a mental activity that is governing the behavior. This mental activity now is identified as cognition, and cognition is where the thinking happens. Behavior is when you act on what you believe. Stimulus is when something in the environment happens that induces behavior. And the thought in the middle, or cognition, is your ability to process the current stimuli and apply the 3 C's of perception, that is consistency, commonality, and consensus, and then act on the same. But a child doesn't develop the ability to have these complex cognitive abilities right away after birth. It takes some time, and there is a developmental model put in place, which I don't want to spend too much time with because it's not that relevant. But Piaget's cognitive development theory sort of explains, at least in terms of only cognition, how our abilities develop. For example, we're beings of response and stimuli, where we're very capable of being shaped by behavioral learning. In the sense, there's a reason why children that are young are more susceptible to classical conditioning, where there is a very strong relationship between stimulus and response, and that basically governs all of life, which is where you're most likely to be subject to classical conditioning, where you can pair a stimulus with a response. Pavlov's dogs and his classical conditioning experiments, where he paired the response of secretion of saliva to a bell, because he used to feed the dogs after the bell, is a great example. Around the same age, children are also susceptible to something called operant conditioning, where you can control behavior or response by providing stimulus in response to behavior, or stimulus to induce behavior. For example, when children are being good, when they clean up after themselves, you give them ice cream at night. If they've been messy, they've been loud, you don't give them ice cream. These are examples of positive reinforcement and negative punishment. The difference between the 4, I'll explain really quickly. If you want to write this down on a paper, that would help if you're a student. If not, you're an adult, you can probably remember things. There's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. Positive reinforcement is when you want to encourage a behavior, you provide a positive stimulus or a stimulus that is desirable by the subject. A negative reinforcement is when you take away a stimulus that is present in the environment of the subject that is undesirable to the subject. So the examples of positive and negative reinforcement essentially are that if a child is exhibiting desirable behavior, for example, he set up his own table before eating, then providing ice cream in dessert would be positive reinforcement because good behavior was then rewarded with a good outcome. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, because the child set up the table before eating, the beetroot salad was not served to him because it doesn't like it. So, a unfavorable outcome or undesirable outcome was avoided by behavior that was desirable to the parent. That is positive and negative reinforcement. As far as positive and negative punishment is concerned, if a child has done something that is undesirable to the parent, then an active stimulus which is undesirable is introduced into the situation. And negative punishment is when a desirable stimulus is taken away from the child to discourage negative behavior or undesirable behavior. For example, a vase was broken by the child inside the house. And hence, not only does he have to eat beetroot, but he will have to eat matki the next morning, which child doesn't like. Also, the parents are not exactly being encouraging of this behavior currently. Negative punishment would be promised ice cream will not be served because the vase was broken by the child. But susceptibility to these methods of controlling or shaping behavior affect other things. For example, the decision-making ability of the child, and most importantly, the cognitive abilities of the child. As far as development on the front of cognition is concerned, the most popular model for cognitive development is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. This model identifies the 4 stages of cognitive development that are largely considered accurate in today's world of psychology, but at the end of the day, it's a theory and it has some limitations. The 4 stages identified in this theory are sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operational stage, and the operational stage. The sensory motor stage is where the behavioral model is at its strongest in application, where there is only stimulus and response and nothing else. The children don't even have the cognitive abilities to process object permanence. That's why when faces are taken away from children and they are reproduced for children, they believe that the faces were destroyed and recreated again. When a cup is kept away and brought back, the children never register that it might be the same object. Essentially, this is the stage where cognitive abilities are so weak that a child cannot even process that something that is not right before its eyes or is being heard currently exists outside of that stimulus. After the sensory motor stage is the pre-operational stage, where some rudimentary cognitive reasoning is generated through intuition, observation, and curiosity. This is the period of life after 2 years to 5 years where children are the most curious, where they want to try everything, they want to touch everything, they want to put everything in their mouths. And the reason for that is because this is experimenting to gather information about the environment. Is this edible? This looks like an edible. There are other things that I eat. I must be able to eat this too, which is what a child reasons. It is the ability that children have at this stage. And again, both of these stages, children are completely egocentric. They are incapable of conceiving of the fact that other things feel the same way as they do. So children don't understand hunger of other people. They don't understand pain or pleasure, or such is the statistical data to support it. So far, the observations in this theory were made accordingly. Then there's concrete operational stage. This is the teen years after the ages of 8 to 13. And cognitions now have started to inform each other. For example, not all things are edible. Some things look like Some things are for eating, some things are for driving, some things are for drinking. Not all things that are liquid are for drinking. And there are skills that they may have acquired in the pre-operational stage. For example, sensory motor stage and pre-operational stage will still be open to operant conditioning. So now they have learned a more complex way which involves cognition. For example, if you make a certain sound, a stimulus will be provided to you which is desirable. And if you act in accordance to something, that procedure will lead to creating this sound which will get you something. For example, food is provided at a certain time, and if you ask for food at that time, you will be given food. Or television. Television is desirable for the child, and the child now has started to understand that they need to earn their TV time, if that is the arrangement in the house. But however, the child now knows how to ask for TV. While the ability to have empathy is still limited at this point, now that like towards the end of the stage, there's also entrance into teenage years, at which point not only will the previously learned skills inform new skills, but curiosity will face limitations of authority. They'll understand slightly more complex, abstract concepts, for example, government or school institution, or what is terrorism or what is violence, what is constituted of violence, why is violence bad. These are questions that you're able to answer in concrete operational stage. And an operational stage is where you're completely capable of processing cognitive information, considering that you've been given the correct information. And now you're also able to generate informed consent. That information can be provided to you, and you are now capable to autonomously inform yourself of these things, and that information can result into decisions which you can be held liable to, or the consequences of those decisions can be held liable to you. A rudimentary understanding of the Piaget's model of cognitive development also informs why legal age of consent is important in our legal stages, because at the age of 18, it is safe to assume that men and women are now capable of thinking for themselves. They can now make decisions such as, do they want to consume alcohol, which distorts their sense of perception and cognition and ability to cognition. They can also make decisions such as make purchases of certain kind which have larger monetary values and maybe even intangible properties concerned. And at this age, it's safe to assume that they understand the consequences of their actions, which is why they can be held criminally liable for all the crimes under sections of various criminal codes in the country. Now, at the pre-operational stage, considering that we get here fine, is the role of language in all of the learning process. Essentially, all cognition that happens currently happens in the form of language, because all cognition is in intent of communication. Is this communication always verbal? No, not necessarily, but it is behavioral, or sometimes even appeals to other senses, for example, tactile or visual senses. For example, language can not only be spoken, it can be written, and it can be visually shown through hands. Like behavioral language is sign language, for example, for people who cannot process sound because they're deaf. Or Braille, which is written for blind individuals, is a language communicated through tactile sensations. However, the role of language is inescapable in the cognitive development and cognitive processing of the human experience. Language, at least generally, is learned through a very clear example of the Albert Bandura's model for social learning, or theory for social learning, where he puts in place the 4 stages of cognitive mediational process. Essentially, social learning functions on a simple premise and assumption that around the subject or the individual are stimuli you're constantly stimulated by, say, the things you're seeing currently, or hearing currently, or touching currently. And the entire idea of social learning is that if you find a behavior desirable, either by an inherent motivation or a motivation that is very simply assumptive of the human condition, that we are conditioned to run towards pleasure and run away from pain, then you will process that information in 4 stages. You will first pay attention to what is happening around you. The stimulus that you like will be identified by you, by a child, or by you, or by a teenager, whoever is capable of either complete or partial cognitive abilities. Then it will be retained, in the sense that you will remember the action that you're paying attention to. For example, the words that somebody's saying, the way somebody's dancing, the way somebody's acting on stage or acting on the dinner table. Retain it and retain other information about it, as in the context in which the action or words, action may have been performed or words may have been spoken, and then try to reproduce it, mimic it essentially, and then mimic it in context of the motivation that you remember from the time you paid attention to, which is why a lot of us exhibit anger or pleasure or pain in the same way as one of our parents or guardian does, because an impressionable adult in the vicinity of a child will govern how they see expression of emotion. This has also been proved by the Bobodol experiment, which was conducted in order to test this theory. And children especially were very good at reproducing the actions of the adults or models that they observed around themselves and considered them as source of credibility. But then again, children are very poor judges of credibility. So they will assign credibility to the person that is immediately around them. And if the person around them already experiences a stimulus that they find or are conditioned to believe is desirable, then there is a higher chance of them wanting to reproduce said behavior. Now comes the part where we exclusively talk about Mr. Wittgenstein's literature. It is important to note that at this point, with the data available, with the psychological studies that we've visited so far in this episode, that it is inescapable to do any learning without experience. You will experience a classroom, and the classroom is where you will learn things. You will get an imitation of what was the experience of someone else in the classroom, in the context of time, place, and the role models you had at the time, along with the predisposition of beliefs that you have at the time. And that is the only way that information can be communicated from one person to another. Tractatus Logicio Philosophicus, the first book that Mr. Wittgenstein wrote, talks about how communication is essentially the act of reproducing an experience that is experienced by a said author into the brain of another person. This book also goes far as to say that this reproduction of said information is completely visual, and the reason he felt that way is when he was reading and observing, closely following a Parisian case of a road accident, and the judge ordered that the events of the day which were concerning this road accident must be recreated physically, because the judge thought it was necessary to visually recreate that day in order to understand what happened for adjudication. Now, the problem here that Wittgenstein identified, which is unsolvable, is that the image that represents an object, for example, in someone's brain, could be completely different from the one that is in your brain. And the further away they are from your experience of life, the less likely for that to have communicated the same thing. For example, similar language speaking tribes from two different corners of the world may have a completely different conception of what a chair looks like. There's also a possible class difference other than a geographical difference. For example, there is a good chance that a privileged person might have grown up with chairs that only have cushions on them, and a chair without a cushion is unlikely to be a chair in their brain. However, a person who's seen only a chair with no cushions as a chair might confuse a chair with cushions for a sofa. And that's where the nuance of Tractatus Logicio Philosophicus kind of ends, in the sense that it is very good at making declarations and observations that very consistently prove the fact that experiences of individuals are completely different. And since the nature of reality itself is so incomprehensibly different from one another, that people who have exhaustingly different experiences might not agree on basic facets of reality sometimes. This argument sort of has a lot of sociological implications as well. For example, if you look at arguments made in intersectional feminism itself, it is sort of in line with Wittgenstein's theory, in the sense that violence may be an inherent part of your experience of life by the virtue of a certain identity. At least in India, the horrific truth of sexual violence against women and physical violence against women is completely and undeniably true. Statistics are all over the place for it. The data collected points to one thing and one thing only, that being woman definitely predisposes an individual to a certain kind of to a certain extent of violence, a certain type of violence. Similar things follow for openly transgendered people, queer people, and the openly homosexual community. But the ability to reason that violence into life may differ. This also borrows itself for the way worldviews shape themselves according to occupations. For example, a doctor is extremely capable of knowing what is the extent of his agency. A lawyer is extremely capable of knowing extent of his or her agency in the face of a problem in front of a courtroom, or in the face of just deaths, in case of a doctor. However, someone who is not with an educational background or in possession of information possessed by a doctor may have that experience completely surprising, in the sense that things that would seem uncurable might be completely curable, and problems that seem completely unfixable because of the logistics of certain things might be completely fixable, which will alter the way, or even cause cognitive dissonance in life because of these experiences. And a visual representation of what pain looks like might be different to different people because of the extent of pain they may have experienced in their life at that point, the nature of pain they have experienced at the point. Trust, for example, is learned the same way. A visual memory of the same is communicated back and forth. However, Wittgenstein goes on to correct himself from visuals to a guessing game of intention. This is where Wittgenstein sort of gets in the nitty-gritties of language, and to a point that it's petty. Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations argues that what essentially when we talk in dry, crude language is play a guessing game where everybody with the cultural context of language is now guessing the intention with which you made a sound. For example, if you ask a friend to pass the bottle of water, the only information that has been passed on to you that the possession of water bottle must be given to this person or is requested by this person to you. The normative assumption that the individual just wants water and not the bottle itself is a different story, which is why somebody might reply with the fact that it's empty, I'll get you water, or that water is in XYZ location currently and you can go grab it from there, but it's not there. With the information currently at hand, it is completely likely that the bottle that they wanted could be to fill water, so they could have access to water at any point that they would like, or for everyone in the room to have access to the bottle at any point that they would like. And philosophical investigations makes a significantly more nuanced point that this communication of intention is a guessing game in where the input is the same, but it could mean different things in different contexts to convey different intentions. And the more abstractions you add to these cognitions, the more specification is required in order to infer intention. For example, if the same person asked you how much water does that bottle hold, the answer in a general connotation would be either full, half, empty, or near about finished, or quite a lot, but not a specific amount. However, there is a good chance that this person is considering purchasing this bottle. So they are now assuming that you know that this bottle is available and mass produced and available at a store to be bought. Two, they're also assuming that you know that volume as a physical dimension is measured by length, height, and breadth. And they would be assuming that the volume of water a bottle can hold is a parameter that you consider while making a purchase of a bottle. Now, as full-grown adults, we have reached a level of sophistication where we have methodologies, contexts that are professional, contexts that are informed by the buildings you're in, the time of the day, communication that is informed by temperature, communication that is informed by emotional state conveyed within the tone with which words are said, with the speed that the words are said, or the physical attributes that are exhibited while the words are said. And this guessing game of intention hits the deck when you enter the field of law. The reason I thought it was so important for me to read this book is because I recently finished law school. Thank you. If you said congratulations in under your breath or out loud. If you said congratulations out loud to a podcaster who is talking to you through the internet and definitely cannot hear you in public, you do look ridiculous. If you did otherwise, thank you. Very cheesy, very nice. Thank you. But because this kind of made me realize how specificity of definition that is emphasized within the practice and study of law is extremely purposive, because this is where information that is gathered and collected and cognitively recorded within a document or a communication that is created within a language is an extremely contextual use and utility of the language. In fact, almost 3 years of law school that I experienced myself were essentially contextualizing the words and the intent with which those words were written within the document. In fact, it is a study in legal history in order to show what are the most important interpretations of the word written within the legislations which might be useful in certain cases. And the Indian Supreme Court uses this in tandem with a concept called constitutional morality, in the sense that they read the intention with which a document was written at the time and how that applies in the light of the knowledge currently in front of human society. For example, in the 2017 Aadhaar judgment, K. Puttaswamy versus Union of India, the right to privacy was never written within the Indian Constitution. Article 21 does not talk about right to privacy anywhere in the document itself. But the fact that privacy is a part of life in an age where everything can be digitally recorded to a extremely precise extent, and all of that information can not only be obtained by somebody else but also produced in a way that it will never go away, is a temporal context that did not exist in 1950. Hence, the concept of privacy itself has changed because of the internet, and hence the law must adapt and the intent of the law must be read to apply to a situation that it was never written in the anticipation of. Hence, intentive reading of the Constitution leads to new law or new reading of the law without actually changing the law. Another much more fun example of this is the difference between culpable homicide and murder. Now, if you Google these two words, the meaning of murder comes out to be the premeditated, unlawful killing of one person by another. And homicide comes out to be the unlawful killing of one person by another. The only difference between the two is premeditation. But to reach that conclusion, there has been intellectualization of difference between section 299 and section 300, to the point that there is actually a Venn diagram that you can draw where all murder is culpable homicide, but all culpable homicide is not murder. The way the law is read is that an event where culpable homicide has occurred, it could amount to murder or not amount to murder. The first condition to understand is that section 299 and section 300 contain the words, the act with the intent to cause death. This is an ingredient present in both the laws. The only difference is within the case of murder, if it is within the 5 exemptions or exceptions mentioned, grave and sudden provocation, excess use of private defense, in exercise of legal power given by the law, sudden heat and fight, or consent, then it won't be murder. It can still be culpable homicide. The difference between culpable homicide and murder here being premeditation of the event. So if you can prove in court that you threw a vase at your friend with the intent of just harming them, then it would not be murder, it might be culpable homicide. But if there is enough evidence to suggest that you premeditated throwing the vase with the intent to cause death, or that you have a knowledge that an injury you will cause will subsequently cause death, that would be murder. Moving on to the understanding of perception and its relationship with language in other aspects than law is research. One of the larger problems in the current scenario of the world is that our researchers, who clearly gather data on a level of experience which is not possible to be had by any single individual at any given point, but is a coagulation of parameters that have been developed over years and decades of scientific research, where current is measured in a certain unit by a certain apparatus whose error unit is also defined by years of experimentation, where experience has been recorded in a way that it can be recreated with as little variation as possible. But because there is no authenticity that is provided by the environment, as an immediate consequence, there is a chance of plausible deniability. And wherever plausible deniability meets credible research, the unfortunate news is that it stops it from becoming actionable information, which is how governance is usually interrupted and becomes slow and sluggish. And I can turn this into an era of like just an episode of complaining about the government at this point. But that is essentially Ludwig van Wittgenstein. Reading Wittgenstein made me feel a little lonely, to the point that in personal communication, the experiences that I have are incommunicable in the smallest of aspects. Maybe the grander emotional peaks of my life are completely isolated as well. So you live with that as well, if possible, because I would feel nicer if everyone was suffering. And that's it. Okay, everyone, that's all I have for you this week for now. Just a warning that like the explanation of Piaget's theory of cognitive development is very reductive. Not to say that it's inaccurate, but it is reductive, and I couldn't do it a lot of justice in the time that I assigned for this podcast. And I hope you liked the episode itself. If you think the episode is worth supporting, please consider donating to my Patreon or buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com. Follow me on Instagram for some memes if that's what you're into. And check out the legal podcast, Legally Tried Neurons, if you're inclined towards legal content. The episode was written, edited, and narrated by me, Deep Fried Neurons. The artwork for the episode is done by Eji Aji on Instagram, or Purva. And the music for the episode has been provided by Siddharth Merchant, aka Triggerfish.woot, on Instagram. Both of their IDs are linked down in the description below for ease of access. And happy monsoon. Unless you're listening to this in like winter 3 years later after the upload, in which case, okay, bye.